Hello, Whisperers. Settle in, subscribe, turn the lights down low, put on your headphones, and listen closely. Tonight's story is a chilling reminder that the most terrifying things don't always live in the deep, untamed wilderness of the Sundarbans or the isolated hills of Sylhet. Sometimes they live right upstairs, in the bustling heart of Dhaka, waiting for you to sign the lease, hand over the advance, and lock the heavy door behind you. This account comes from a listener named HS. The things that shared his family's home didn't care about logic, and they certainly didn't care about boundaries. They only cared about fear. I'm going to step back now and tell you exactly what happened in HS's own words, using his name as an alias. Take a deep breath. Let's begin. I was in class 9 back in 2013, studying in the morning shift at Dhaka Residential Model College. My life had a very simple rhythm. Classes ended by 1 p.m. and my sweltering afternoons were fiercely dedicated to becoming a pro FIFA player. My family had just shifted from Kilgaon in Dhaka to a massive, sprawling apartment on Tajmahal Road in Mohammadpur, Dhaka. The flat felt a little too big. The corridors were a little too long, and the shadows in the corners always seemed to stretch just an inch further than the daylight allowed. Our house was always full. There was me, my mom, dad, my baby sister Ariba, who was just a toddler, barely speaking in broken syllables. We also had 2 helping hands living with us, a teenage boy named Rabbi and a girl named Rumi. For the first month, the flat was quiet, but looking back, I realized the house wasn't peaceful. It was observant. It was taking its time, learning our routines, memorizing the cadence of our footsteps, and studying the specific pitch of our voices. The first crack in reality was subtle. I had just finished a grueling, sweaty FIFA match and walked across my room to use the washroom. I turned the knob, but it was locked tight. Assuming someone was inside, I retreated to my room, played another full match for about 12 minutes, and tried again. Still closed. No sound of running water, no shifting feet, just dead, heavy silence behind the wood. Annoyed, I walked over to my mom's room to ask who was taking so long. But when I pushed the bedroom door open, I froze. Mom, Ariba, Rabbi, and Rumi, they were all sitting right there, watching TV and chatting. There was absolutely no one else in the apartment, I can assure you of that. A cold prickle of unease washed over me. Mom and I walked back to the washroom. The balcony beside it had access to a thigh glass window on the bathroom wall. It offered a narrow peek into the bathroom from the outside. I pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hand to block the glare. The washroom was completely and utterly empty. The floor was dry, but the heavy metal deadbolt had been firmly and deliberately slid shut from the inside. Eventually, the building guard had to come up and break the lock. Mom, desperate to keep the peace in our new home, waved it off. It's just a rusty, faulty latch, she insisted. But latches don't slide themselves into the locking groove. By the second month, whatever was living in the walls decided it was time to introduce itself. And it chose to do so by wearing our faces. One humid afternoon, Rabbi went to sleep in my room after lunch. It was something he did regularly. The apartment was completely silent, draped in that lethargic afternoon heat. Hours later, Mom came sprinting into my room, breathless, her eyes wide with a frantic energy. She demanded to know if Rabbi had just walked in. Confused, I pointed to the bed. No, Mom. He's been asleep for hours. He hasn't moved. When Dad came home that night, Mom finally explained what she had seen. From her bed, she had a clear, unobstructed view of the living space. While reading, she heard the frantic, wet slap of her bare feet against the floor tiles. She looked up to see Rabbi sprinting full speed across the living room. But suddenly he slammed on the brakes. His body jolted into a dead halt, completely defying the momentum. He slowly, mechanically turned his head towards Mom and then he smiled. But it wasn't Rabbi's smile. Mom described it as a horrifying, ear-to-ear, physically impossible grin. It stretched so wide it looked like the skin of his cheeks were tearing. His eyes were completely dead, unblinking black voids. And then, just as abruptly, the boy spun around and sprinted into the hallway. Dad completely dismissed it. He's just a teenage boy playing a stupid prank, he rationalized. But the house wasn't playing. A few weeks later, the mimicry targeted Mom directly again. I was practicing like every other day, but was violently jolted by a blood-curdling scream that tore through the quiet apartment. I sprinted to Mom's room to find her backed against the headboard, hyperventilating. She was clutching her chest, her body radiating a sudden, violent fever. I rushed to the kitchen, my hands shaking, and forced a glass of cold water into her hands. When her breathing finally slowed enough for her to whisper, she pointed a trembling finger at the foot of her bed. She had woken up moments earlier. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized someone was crouching in the corner of the bed. It was Rumi, the female help. Rumi wasn't in that exact same horrifying, physically impossible grin. She was perfectly still in the corner of the bed, staring down at Mom. And in the ambient afternoon light bleeding through the window, Mom saw her face. It was contorted like the entity was wearing Rumi's skin like a poorly fitted suit. From that day onwards, Mom refused to sleep in total darkness. She demanded the doors be left slightly ajar so the hallway light could bleed in. During that summer, Dhaka suffered from brutal, relentless load shedding. One night, the power cut out entirely, leaving the apartment bathed only in the pale, sickly light of a full moon. Dad, sweating and frustrated, asked Rabbi to fetch some ice cream from the fridge. Rabbi took a candle and walked into the pitch-black kitchen. A few seconds later, the deafening, sharp clatter of dropping steel echoed through the silent house. Rabbi came bolting into the living room, his face completely drained of blood. Through the kitchen window, there was a clear view of the rooftop of an old, crumbling Pakistani-era house next door. Rabbi, his voice vibrating with terror, told us there was a person sitting on that roof and they had 2 heads. We all crowded in the kitchen. The moonlight illuminated a dark, massive, hunched figure on the neighboring ledge. The proportions were entirely wrong, bulging and shifting in the gloom. Mom, desperately trying to maintain her grip on reality, loudly declared it was just a mother sitting with a baby on her lap. She even yelled out the open window, asking the person to step forward into the moonlight so the kids wouldn't be terrified. The figure didn't move a single muscle. It just sat there, watching us. My bedroom shared the exact same architectural view of that room. Dad marched into my room to get a better angle and prove Mom right. But when Dad looked out of my window, the rooftop was completely empty. There was nothing there but bare concrete. Yet, when he called out to us in the kitchen, we screamed back that the bloated two-headed silhouette was still sitting right there, staring back at us. The house was bending our reality and isolating our perception. Next day, Dad went downstairs to the hog bakery next door. He cornered the employees. "Is there a problem with the flat upstairs?" he demanded. The men stopped working. They exchanged dark, nervous glances. They refused to give any specific details. But the manager leaned over the glass counter and whispered, "Bhai, leave that flat. Leave as soon as you can. Do not wait." Instead of fleeing, Dad took us to our hometown for Eid, hoping the bad energy would dissipate. He thought leaving the flat empty would starve whatever was in there. It only made it angry. The morning after we returned, I woke up with a sharp, burning agony across my chest. I pulled down my shirt and gasped. Deep red, inflamed scratch marks were violently etched across my flesh. I tried to convince myself I had simply scratched myself in my sleep. I walked into the living room to ask Mom for some antiseptic ointment. Robbie was standing right there. He took one look at my exposed chest and his knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor and confessed to Mom what he had seen the night before. He had woken up in the middle of the night to a suffocating drop in temperature. He looked over at my bed and saw a glowing, pure white figure sitting heavily on top of my chest. It had no face, just a blinding luminescence. Rabbi had watched, paralyzed, his throat locked in terror, as the entity slowly, methodically dragged his impossibly long blackened nails across my flesh, from my left ribcage across to my sternum, to the right, and slowly back again. The entity then began isolating us. Rumi used a separate washroom equipped with a high thigh glass ventilation window. She began complaining that someone was watching her. She swore she could feel a gaze piercing through the glass. She initially blamed Rabbi, but Mom quickly corrected her. Rabbi had been sitting right next to Mom in the living room the entire time. And a few days later, while Rumi was happily playing with baby Ariba, she screamed. An invisible hand had violently grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked it backward toward that exact same ventilation window. And then came the day we made the fatal mistake of leaving Rabbi entirely alone. Everyone except Dad went to a family gathering in Uttora. Dad was supposed to come home for lunch, but work held him up. Rabbi was left completely by himself in the echoing apartment. When we finally unlocked the front door that evening, Rabbi launched himself at Mom, wrapping his arms around her waist, sobbing so hard he was choking. Basically, he had fallen asleep in his room. He woke up with the sound of a comforting, familiar voice calling out to him in the dead silence of the flat. Rabbi, Baba Idigai. It was his mother's voice. But Rabbi's mother lived in their village hundreds of miles away, and worse, the voice was echoing, muffled and dusty from directly under the bed. As he lay frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, he heard a second voice join in. It was his little sister giggling maliciously from the dark beneath the mattress. He had lain there for hours, rigid, too terrified to blink, staring at the small gap between the mattress and the floor, waiting for a hand to reach out. The entity's final unforgivable target was my baby sister. It was late. Dad was in the master bedroom, gently rocking Ariba to sleep. Suddenly, I heard my dad scream a raw, guttural, animalistic sound of pure terror. I threw open my door and sprinted down the hall, just in time to see Dad rushing into the washroom. He was holding Ariba's limp body, desperately splashing cold water onto her tiny face, his hand shaking violently. I thought my sister passed away. Something happened to her, I was sure. I stepped into the doorway, and the breath left my lungs. Ariba's eyes had completely rolled back into her skull. There were no pupils, just empty, terrifying, milky white voids staring blankly at the ceiling. Her little body was entirely rigid. Dad was weeping openly, screaming that his daughter was dead. I was sure my sister was gone. I thought we lost her. Mom pushed past us and began frantically reciting the Durud Sharif and the Ayatul Kursi, their voice shaking and cracking with panic. Suddenly, Ariba gasped. She blinked and her dark pupils snapped violently back into place. Her rigid body broke and she burst into terrified wails. Dad seized the baby from my mom and yelled we had to leave immediately. It was 3 a.m. in the morning. Dad and I didn't even grab our shoes. We ran down the street, flagged down a passing rickshaw van in the dead of the night, and rushed Ariba to City Hospital. The emergency doctors examined her thoroughly and found absolutely nothing wrong. But Dad at that point was terrified. He begged them to keep her admitted. While we were at the hospital, Mom and my aunt made the horrifying decision to go back to the cursed flat just to pack Ariba's baby food. The apartment felt venomous when they walked in. Mom stepped into the bathroom for a quick shower while my aunt went to the kitchen. A few minutes in, Mom heard a sharp, aggressive knock on the bathroom door. She opened it to find Auntie standing there, looking all sorts of confused. "Did you need anything?" Auntie asked her, her voice tight. Mom stared at her confusingly. "I didn't say a word. I'm showering." Before either of them could process anything, a deafening bang echoed across the dining room. It sounded like a gunshot. They ran out. Sitting in the center of the dining room floor were two heavy, full 2-liter plastic water bottles. But they weren't just knocked over. They were violently and completely flattened, crushed to the thickness of a coin, as if an entity of impossible weight had just stomped its foot right down the middle of the room. It's not easy crushing those bottles full of water. Water was everywhere. Mom grabbed my aunt's arm Leave the food. Let's leave now. Eventually, we fled to my uncle's house and stayed there for an entire month, refusing to step foot on Tajmahal Road. We only returned for one final agonizing night to pack our belongings. At this point, we refused to separate. Dad declared we would all sleep in one room, barricaded together. Dad and Ariba took the main bed, while everyone else camped on the floor around them. Mom sat in the corner clutching the Quran, continuously reading the verses aloud. As the holy words filled the room, the house threw a tantrum. From the empty kitchen down the hall, we heard the violent, unmistakable sounds of plates shattering and heavy pots being hurled against the wall. Ariba suddenly sat upright in the bed. She didn't cry. She just pointed a tiny, trembling finger at the absolute darkest corner of the mattress. "Snake," she whispered to Dad. Dad finally snapped. Pushing past fear into pure anger, he handed Ariba to Mom, grabbed a heavy steel serving tray, wrapped it in newspaper, and set the paper on fire. Holding the flaming torch, he marched out of the bedroom into the pitch-black flat to hunt down whatever that was tormenting us. He searched every room. He found nothing. He returned to the bedroom exhausted right before Fajr, as the very first faint calls to prayer began to echo over Mohammadpur. The heavy, solid wood bed frame began to shake violently and aggressively. Dad didn't scream. He just sat on the floor, watched the bed vibrate, and let out a dry, hollow laugh. "They're just pissed off because I disturbed them," he muttered. When the sun rose, we packed the trucks, and that was our last day in that house. We moved into a new apartment in Mohammedia housing, desperate for a clean slate, but trauma doesn't just stay behind in empty rooms. It burrows into your bone. In the new house, Ariba changed. She would constantly hide behind heavy living room curtains. We would hear her whispering and giggling and holding out pieces of her food to the empty air. When Mom would gently pull the fabric back and ask what was she looking at, Ariba would smile with a wide, innocent smile and say, "Bandhavi." The entity had latched onto her innocence. Rabbi never recovered. His skin turned a sickly, bruised, jaundiced yellow. He lost weight, his eyes constantly darting to the corners of the ceiling. Dad grew desperate and brought in a pious hujur from our village. The moment the holy man stepped into the drawing room, Rabbi took one look at him, collapsed to his knees, and began to violently weep. The hujur quickly prayed over a glass of water and forced the boy to drink it. Rabbi thrashed, gagging and clawing at his own throat, reacting as if the water was burning him, as if an invisible hand was trying to rip the very soul out of his mouth. The hujur told us that the entities from Tajmahal Road hadn't fully crossed the threshold into the new house, but the psychological rot they had inflicted deeply traumatized the baby and the boy. The shadow left its mark. My family eventually moved yet again, constantly trying to outrun the memories. My mom remains deeply, permanently paranoid to this very day. She checks every shadow and locks every door twice. Months later, Dad went back to Hawk Bakery. He slammed his hand on the counter and finally demanded the truth from the manager. The manager looked unashamed. He confessed that in the entire history of that building, no tenant had ever lasted more than 3 months in that specific flat. The bakery employees had assumed we were perfectly fine because we had somehow managed to survive the torment for 7 long months. The apartment across the bakery remains completely unrentable. The landlord cannot keep a tenant. It sits abandoned, its windows dark and coated in dust right in the bustling heart of Dhaka. Don't believe me? Take a walk down Tajmahal Road. Look for the Hawk Bakery. Look up at the dark, empty windows on the floors across the bakery. That was ages' story. The hills and forests have their own ancient ghosts, but there's something uniquely terrifying about a concrete box in the middle of a crowded city that simply refuses to let you live in it. If you ever find yourself staring into the dark corners of your own bedroom tonight, and you see someone looking back at you with a smile that stretches just a little too wide, do not smile back. And whatever you do not let them learn your name. Shubhoratri. Sleep lightly.